Hey there, friends. So today we're going to do a deep dive on the knife and why the knife is the most versatile tool in a woodworker's tool chest and why it is so important for beginning woodworkers. If you've heard anything about Sloyd, and you've heard me use the term Sloyd quite a bit, a lot of times you think of the term Sloyd knife, and that is a very specific kind of knife. But when it comes into handcraft or hand wood tool woodworking, it really does not matter what kind of knife you've got. So I've got several different options here. These are actually the most expensive knives in my collection. They are Swiss made, very good steel, excellent knife. Personally, I'm not a big fan of how they fit in my hand. So next on the list is this carving knife by a company called Handtool. Very nice. I love the way it feels in my hand. It's a good mixture of hardness of steel and ease of sharpening. But even these are specialty carving knives. An old pocket knife works just fine. If you're going to use an old pocket knife, probably want to use the smaller blade. This is an old knife that actually my son had from years ago, single bladed item. You know, and even this was a little, I don't know, a gadget. I picked this up as a door prize or something like that. But, you know, it's got a blade that can be used for woodworking. So the key point is it does not matter what kind of knife you have. My only two rules are that it feels good in your hand, and that is number one. And number two, it's got a decent quality steel. But even that is subjective because the harder the steel, the longer it will stay sharp, but the harder it is to sharpen. So there's kind of a trade-off there. That's why I like this flex tool. It's really kind of a good balance between the two. But why is the knife so important? Well, Otto Salomon in his books really gives three reasons for why the knife is the best tool to get started with when you're doing hand tool woodworking. Number one, probably not as relevant today as it was back in the 1880s when he actually wrote down his rules. And that is that every boy, by the time he goes to school, remember we're now talking 5 or 6 years old, every boy by the time he goes to school is already familiar with the knife and already knows how to do the basic knife cuts. Now, I don't know very many 5 and 6 year olds that are given knives these days, but the rule still applies. People love to whittle, they love to carve, so that's a good reason. Reason number two, a little bit more complicated, but with patience, you can do just about any woodworking operation with a knife. You want to cut a mortise and tenon? You can do that with a knife. It'll take you a long time to do it, but it's possible. Basic shaping and things like that can all be done with the knife. So the knife is one of the few tools where you can create a project start to finish. Okay? The third reason that Otto Salomon really prefers starting with the knife is that it really helps you understand grain. What do we mean by that? All right, let's zoom in just a little bit so we can take a look at the grain issue. Get these knives out of the way. I'll bring the other camera over. That. Okay, I'm going to spread this out just so we have a better contrast. All right. So this is a piece of yellow pine. See if I can get down a little closer. Maybe you can see this better. And the reason I picked this is it really gives us a picture of the different types of grain. So when we look at the grain, we'll have sections of light color and sections of dark. And this really refers to the growing seasons. The dark areas are a little bit slower growth. The light areas are more rapid growth. So the lighter areas are easier to carve. The darker areas a little bit more difficult. Okay? So this section right here is really considered a straight grain pattern because we're able to cut straight along here. Okay? As we get next to this knot, we start to see a curl here. Okay, the gray grain starts to curl upwards, and this is what we're talking about when we say the grain is changing direction. So we're going from a very straight grain to a rising grain pattern. We get to the knot, and you see that the grain is pointing almost straight up, and then all of a sudden, as we get to the other side of the knot, the grain starts to fall. So now we're going against the grain, and this section right here is where we're referring to a reversing grain pattern. Rising grain reverses over to falling grain. I'm sure many of you have heard the analogies of grain and straws. So grain is really like a bunch of straws that are put together. The water and minerals go up and down the pores, which are the grain, and they are held together by lignin. Or don't hold me to that word, but when you're cutting with the grain, you're not actually destroying the grain itself. You're actually cutting the fibers between the grain, and therefore it's easier to separate. When you're cutting across the grain, now this is where you're actually you're cutting into the hardest part of the wood. So you're actually cutting the wood fibers at this point. So this is considered a ripping operation. This is considered a cross cut. Right? But how does that play out when we have this rising grain pattern? So sticking with our straw analogy, so this part of the grain is nice and straight, so we would be cutting along the grain. But now as we get here, the grain starts to bend. Okay? And we can even stack this up here like this. So as you're cutting, right, you start off cutting with the grain, everything is nice and simple, and boom, all of a sudden now you're cutting oblique to the grain. So in this one piece, we are going to go from an easy long grain cut to an oblique cut to a falling or unsupported grain. And this area is where you're likely to get a bunch of tear out. All right, so how does that impact us? Well, there are 4 basic cuts that you're going to need to know as you're dealing with this. And the knife is really a great way to understand how grain reacts to your cutting tools, because every cutting tool is really some variation of the knife. It's a cutting blade that is going to impact the wood. Right? 4 cuts. The first cut is considered a long cut, and this is where you are cutting with the grain. So just nice kind of peeling. So if you've seen hand planes, you'll see how you'll start to get some curls, some shavings. You can get kind of the same thing here. Okay? Long grain cut. Now, in this straight area, it doesn't really matter if you're cutting this way or if you turn it around and you start cutting this way, because you're cutting long grain all the way. Okay? So that's cut number 1. That is called the long cut. Cut number 2 is the oblique cut, and this is where you start to get at a little bit of an angle, and you're cutting now at a diagonal across the grain. Okay, so you can do that. Personally, I like to use my thumb because it gives us more control. Anchor the wood as much as you can on the bench or on the cutting block. But you see how that is more difficult? You hear that little crunching sound? That's actually cutting across the grain. So cut number 1, long cut with the grain. Cut number 2, oblique cut. Cut number 3 then is what's called a sawing cut or a cross cut. And this is the most difficult cut to make with a knife. A couple of ways you can do that. One, you can score and just work your way deeper. It's almost like you're sawing. And again, this really depends on how thick the piece is that you're trying to cut. And you just work your way down. You can come in, put a little bit of a V cut in there. Okay, that's not quite as hard as going straight across there. The other way you can do it then is to just start at the top and then come this way. Now if you're going to do this, you've got to be extremely careful, because you never want to cut where the knife can slip and actually get you. So you have to be very careful to make sure there's always wood between you and your flesh. So be very careful about that when you're coming in from the other directions like this. All right, first 3 cuts: long cut, oblique cut, cross cut. And you just work your way down. The 4th type cut is actually a relative of the long cut, and that's called the bevel cut. And that's if you want to put a 45-degree bevel on the side here. Okay, so you can see it's exactly like the long cut. But I don't know if you noticed anything, but when I got down to here, it actually broke rather than cut. Because you notice how the grain is starting to fall from here to here. This would actually be considered a fallen cut, almost going against the grain at this point. So we got a little bit of tear out there. But those are the kinds of things that you really can feel when you're using the knife. If we turn it this way, we can still do the long cut, but it's a little bit more difficult. But we're not going to experience the cutout or the breakout that we would going in the other direction, because we are supporting ourselves with the grain. All right, so this is a good reason to use the knife and start to understand the grain. All right, friends. I encourage you, if you're just starting out in woodworking, or if you've got a younger woodworker just getting ready to start out, grab Grandpa's knife. If nothing else, grab Grandpa's pocket knife. Make sure it's good and sharp. Sharp blade is actually safer than a dull blade. And just start whittling, making sure you follow all the safety rules. Cut away from yourself. On the rare occasion that you cut toward yourself, make sure there's always wood between you and your flesh, there's always wood between the knife and your body, okay? And just start experimenting and seeing how the knife reacts to the wood. You know, grab your rocking chair, go sit out on the porch and make some shavings. All right, friends? I think that's gonna wrap it up today. If you like this style, there are going to be more videos like this. So if you like this, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and so you'll get notified anytime more of these videos come out. Okay, I think that's going to do it, friends. Take care. God bless.